4 days after 13-year-old Ben Ownby disappeared in Beaufort, Missouri, police entered an apartment in Kirkwood expecting to find one missing boy. Instead, they found two. Ben was alive, and inside that same apartment was 15-year-old Shawn Hornbeck, a boy who had disappeared more than 4 years earlier and whose family had spent years wondering whether they would ever see him again. The discovery stunned investigators and transformed two separate missing child investigations into one of Missouri's most extraordinary kidnapping cases. The Missouri State Highway Patrol later described the 2007 events as a case in which both boys were found alive in a suspect's apartment after Ben's disappearance led investigators to the location. But the discovery did not begin with a sophisticated forensic breakthrough. It began with something much smaller. A teenager noticed a white pickup truck. Before we go further, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Ben's disappearance began in a small Missouri community, but the investigation quickly reached far beyond it. On January 8, 2007, Ben Ownby was 13 years old. He lived in Beaufort, Missouri, a small community in Franklin County, southwest of St. Louis. That afternoon, Ben got off his school bus. He was expected to make the short journey from the bus stop toward home, but he never arrived. According to the Missouri State Highway Patrol's account, Ben got off the school bus and was abducted while walking from the bus toward his residence. The FBI later described the case as one in which a Missouri teenager disappeared after school, triggering a multi-agency search. For his family, the difference between an ordinary afternoon and a missing child emergency happened in a matter of minutes. Ben's father, Don Ownby, reported his son missing. Authorities immediately began searching. The circumstances were deeply concerning. Ben had not simply failed to come home. Investigators had reason to believe he had been abducted. The FBI's role in child abduction investigations can begin immediately when circumstances indicate that a child may have been taken. The Bureau explains that there is no requirement to wait 24 hours before federal involvement in a suspected child abduction. In Ben's case, local police, the Missouri State Highway Patrol, the FBI, and other agencies became involved. An Amber Alert was issued, and the search quickly became public. Photographs and descriptions of Ben were circulated. Investigators began gathering information from anyone who might have seen something unusual around the time he disappeared. That was when an important witness came forward. A schoolmate had seen something near the location where Ben vanished. It was a white pickup truck. The witness remembered enough about it to provide investigators with useful information. The FBI later said that an alert classmate had seen the white pickup truck fleeing the scene and provided details to authorities. That observation became one of the crucial pieces of information in the search. At first glance, a vehicle description might seem like a small lead, but in a missing child investigation, a small lead can become the thread that connects everything. Investigators now had something tangible to work with: a vehicle, a description, a location, and a very short window of time. The FBI established a multi-agency command post soon after Ben was reported missing. According to the Bureau's later account, the operation generated and processed approximately 800 leads. A child abduction rapid deployment team also provided investigative and technical assistance. The search expanded. People were asked to remember what they had seen. Investigators worked through information coming from the public. The media kept Ben's disappearance in the public eye, and somewhere in that growing pile of information was the white pickup truck. But while authorities were searching for Ben, another missing child case was waiting in the background. 4 years earlier, on October 6, 2002, 11-year-old Shawn Hornbeck had disappeared while riding his bicycle in Richwoods, Missouri. His disappearance had remained unresolved. For Shawn's family, 4 years had passed without the answer they wanted most. Where was their son? What had happened to him? And would they ever see him again? The Missouri State Highway Patrol later summarized the connection plainly. Shawn had disappeared in 2002, and then Ben disappeared in January 2007. The investigation into Ben ultimately led authorities to the location where both boys were found alive. But in those first days after Ben disappeared, investigators did not yet know that. They were looking for one child. They did not know they were about to uncover another. Ben's disappearance had created urgency, and the witness who noticed the truck had given investigators something they could follow. Now that you know who Ben Ownby was and how quickly his disappearance became a community-wide search, what do you think that schoolmate noticed that others might have missed? Tell me in the comments. Sometimes the smallest observation becomes the most important part of a case. The investigation moved toward the St. Louis area. The white pickup truck had become a significant lead. According to the FBI's account, law enforcement officers in the St. Louis suburbs eventually spotted the truck in a local apartment complex parking lot 4 days after Ben disappeared. That was January 12, 2007. The vehicle was connected to a man named Michael Devlin. Devlin was 41 years old and worked as a manager at a pizzeria. Investigators went to his apartment in Kirkwood, Missouri. At that point, they were looking for Ben. They did not know what else was behind the door. When authorities searched the apartment, they found Ben. He was alive. For 4 days, his family had been living through the uncertainty of not knowing where he was. Now he had been located. But then came the second discovery. There was another boy inside. His name was Shawn Hornbeck. He was 15 years old, and he had been missing since October 2002. The FBI later described the moment as the discovery of not only the missing teenager authorities had been searching for, but another boy who had been missing for 4 years. For Shawn's family, the news was almost impossible to comprehend. Their son, who had disappeared years earlier, had been found alive. For Ben's family, their son's disappearance had unexpectedly become the key that revealed what had happened to Shawn. 2 cases had suddenly become one. The Missouri State Highway Patrol's 2007 annual report called the event a remarkable success, involving state troopers, local and federal authorities, and what it described as a series of fortunate breaks. The white truck had mattered. The witness had mattered. The rapid response had mattered. And the decision to follow the evidence had mattered. The case also demonstrated something important about missing person investigations. Sometimes the investigation that solves one disappearance does more than locate the person currently being searched for. Sometimes it exposes another mystery that has been waiting for years. In this case, Ben's disappearance reopened the story of Shawn Hornbeck, and the man connected to both cases was now in custody. Michael Devlin was arrested on January 12, 2007. The investigation did not end with the boys being found. In many ways, it was only beginning. Authorities now had to reconstruct what had happened. They had to determine how the abductions occurred. They had to gather evidence. They had to protect the boys. And they had to build criminal cases that could withstand scrutiny in court. The FBI later said approximately 50 of its agents and specialists contributed to the investigation. Its victim specialists helped coordinate medical examinations and other services for the boys, while forensic interviewers were used to reduce the need for repeated interviews. That detail is important because the boys were not simply evidence in a criminal case. They were children who had been missing from their families. The investigation had to uncover the truth while also protecting them from unnecessary additional trauma. Authorities searched Devlin's apartment for evidence. The FBI's St. Louis Evidence Response Team assisted with the search. Investigators also worked with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. A new multi-agency task force was formed to examine the investigation and determine whether there might be connections to other missing children. As investigators worked, more information emerged about Devlin and the 2 kidnappings. The criminal case eventually included charges connected to kidnapping and sexual abuse. Because Ben was a minor, the details of the abuse are not necessary to understand the central story, and they do not need to be described graphically. What matters for this account is that the evidence gathered by investigators resulted in extensive criminal charges and ultimately guilty pleas. The case was not left unresolved. It went to court, and Michael Devlin admitted responsibility. On October 8, 2007, Devlin pleaded guilty in Franklin County to kidnapping Ben Ownby and to armed criminal action connected to the abduction. A judge sentenced him to life in prison for the kidnapping charge and an additional 20 years for the armed criminal action charge. Those sentences were ordered to run concurrently in the Franklin County case. Ben's parents were present in court. The guilty plea meant Ben would not have to endure a public trial and testify about the kidnapping. For the family, that mattered. The prosecution had built a case supported by evidence strong enough that Devlin's defense attorney described the evidence as overwhelming. But Ben's case was only one part of the legal proceedings. Devlin also faced charges relating to Shawn Hornbeck, and the legal consequences connected to Shawn's kidnapping were severe. In October 2007, Devlin pleaded guilty in the case involving Shawn as well. The court proceedings revealed that Shawn had been held for more than 4 years. The details were disturbing, but the most important fact is that Shawn survived. He had disappeared as an 11-year-old boy. He was found alive at 15. That alone changed the way people understood his disappearance. For years, the public had known Shawn as a missing child. Now investigators knew where he had been. The discovery also challenged assumptions people often make about missing person cases. A child can disappear without leaving obvious answers behind. A family can search for years. A community can wonder. And yet the person responsible may remain much closer than anyone expects. In Shawn's case, the answer was eventually found in an apartment in the St. Louis suburb of Kirkwood. In Ben's case, the answer came only 4 days after his disappearance. The connection between the two cases was not planned by investigators. It emerged because Ben's disappearance generated a new investigation, and that investigation followed a vehicle. The story is sometimes remembered as a miracle. The Missouri State Highway Patrol itself referred to 2007 as a year of miracles in its annual report, emphasizing that both boys were found alive. But behind that outcome were hundreds of people doing the less dramatic work of an investigation. Calls were received. Leads were recorded. Information was checked. Vehicles were identified. Agencies coordinated. Witnesses spoke. Investigators followed up. And eventually, a truck led police to an apartment. Investigators had a vehicle description, hundreds of leads, and a missing child. What do you think was the most important piece of evidence that connected Ben's disappearance to Michael Devlin? Put your theory in the comments, based only on the facts we've covered so far. For 4 days, Ben's family had been living with uncertainty. For more than 4 years, Shawn's family had lived with it. The difference between those timelines is difficult to comprehend. Ben disappeared on January 8, 2007. By January 12, he had been found. Shawn disappeared on October 6, 2002. By January 12, 2007, more than 4 years had passed. And yet the two stories became connected in a single afternoon of investigation. The rescue of the boys was the moment the public saw the story change. But for their families, the aftermath was just as important. Being found did not mean everything immediately returned to normal. In the days following the rescue, Ben's family asked for privacy while he adjusted to being home and returning to a normal routine. CNN reported that his mother said he was doing well and that the family wanted privacy as he returned to school and everyday life. Shawn's return was different. He had been missing for years. His family had to reconnect with a teenager who had experienced a long period away from them. CNN reported that his recovery was being handled more carefully because of the length of time he had been gone. with family and friends helping him reconnect with life outside captivity. That distinction matters. The rescue was a beginning, not an ending. The word "found" can make a missing person story sound finished. But families know better. A person can be physically home while still having a long road ahead. And in cases involving children, that road can include medical care, counseling, family support, education, and the slow process of rebuilding a sense of ordinary life. The FBI later described the victim support efforts that followed the rescue, including medical examinations, victim assistance, and carefully conducted forensic interviews designed to reduce repeated questioning. The criminal investigation continued alongside that recovery. There were court hearings, there were guilty pleas, there were sentencing decisions, and there were questions about how two missing children could have been held by the same person without the connection being discovered sooner. The public reaction was intense. The case received national attention, but for Ben's family, the most important headline was simple: their son was alive. For Shawn's family, it was equally simple: their son was alive. That is what should remain at the center of this story. Not the sensational details, not the speculation, not the disturbing questions that surrounded the case. The two boys, two families, two disappearances, and one investigation that ultimately brought them home. For years, Shawn Hornbeck's family waited for answers, while Ben Ownby's family suddenly found themselves living through the same fear. If you've ever had to wait for someone you love, take a moment to acknowledge what those families endured. There is another part of this story that deserves attention: the witness. The teenager who saw the white pickup truck did not solve the case alone, but the information he provided became an important investigative lead. The FBI later credited an alert classmate with seeing the truck and providing details that helped authorities identify it. That is a powerful reminder of why investigators ask the public to pay attention. A person does not have to know that they have witnessed a crime. They may simply notice something that feels unusual. A vehicle, a person, a direction, a sound, a detail that seems insignificant at the time. In Ben's case, the vehicle became significant, and because the witness remembered it, investigators had something to pursue. The investigation also showed why time matters in child abduction cases. The FBI says child abductions require immediate attention, and that its child abduction rapid deployment teams can be deployed soon after an abduction is reported. Ben's case moved quickly. The missing person alert went out. The public became aware. Investigators established a command post. Hundreds of leads were processed. The vehicle was located, and within 4 days, Ben was found. That speed changed the outcome. It also changed another family's story. Because without Ben's disappearance, Shawn's location might not have been discovered when it was. This is why the title of this story matters. One boy's disappearance revealed another. Ben's case did not simply end with his rescue. It opened the door to an older mystery. And behind that mystery was a family that had spent years waiting. The legal case eventually reached its conclusion. Devlin pleaded guilty to the charges related to Ben and Shawn, as well as additional federal charges. The Missouri State Highway Patrol later recorded that Devlin pleaded guilty to all charges and received multiple consecutive life terms. The exact number of sentences reported in different contemporary accounts varies depending on whether the source is describing one jurisdiction, a group of state cases, or the full collection of state and federal sentences. For the central Ben Ownby case, the Franklin County sentence was life imprisonment plus 20 years for armed criminal action, running concurrently. That distinction is worth making, because court outcomes can be described differently when a defendant faces charges across multiple jurisdictions. What does not change is the central outcome. Michael Devlin was convicted through guilty pleas. Ben was alive, Shawn was alive, and both families received answers to questions that had once seemed impossible to resolve. The story also became a lesson in how missing child investigations can intersect. Shawn's disappearance had been treated as its own case. Ben's disappearance was a new case, but one suspect connected them. The same apartment connected them, and the same investigation ultimately revealed both. The two cases had been separated by more than 4 years. They were connected by 4 days. And the connecting point was a white pickup truck. The image of that truck became one of the most important visual details in the case. But it was not the truck itself that solved anything. It was the human observation behind it. Someone saw it. Someone remembered it. Someone reported it. Investigators followed it, and eventually they reached the apartment. That chain of events is easy to overlook when looking backward. After we know how the story ended, every step can seem obvious. But at the time, investigators did not have the ending. They had a missing 13-year-old boy. They had a family waiting. They had a community searching. They had a vehicle description. And they had hundreds of pieces of information that had to be sorted. Some leads would matter, others would not. Some would point investigators in the wrong direction. Others would bring them closer. The FBI later described the operation as a partnership among law enforcement, the media, the public, and missing child organizations. That partnership is part of what made the rescue possible. There was no single magical piece of technology. There was no cinematic moment in which one detective suddenly understood everything. There was a chain, and every link mattered. The public saw the case through news coverage. Investigators saw it through evidence and leads. Ben's family experienced it through fear and hope. Shawn's family experienced it through years of uncertainty, followed by an unimaginable reunion. And the boys experienced it as something much more personal. They had been taken from their families. They were found, and then they had to begin rebuilding their lives. That is where the story should end. Not with the offender, with the children who survived. Ben Ownby disappeared at 13. His disappearance lasted 4 days. But those 4 days changed the course of another family's 4-year search. Shawn Hornbeck disappeared at 11. His family waited more than 4 years. And when investigators finally entered Michael Devlin's Kirkwood apartment, they did not find the ending they expected. They found 2 missing boys. One had just disappeared. The other had been missing for years. The rescue was extraordinary because it brought both of them home alive. And the investigation that followed ensured that the responsibility for what happened did not disappear with them. Michael Devlin's guilty pleas brought the criminal proceedings to a close. For Ben's family, there was no longer the question of where their son was. For Shawn's family, there was finally an answer to the question that had haunted them since 2002. But an answer does not erase the years that came before it. It does not erase the fear. It does not erase the searching. It does not erase the empty space left behind when a child disappears. What it can do is end the uncertainty. And sometimes, that is the beginning of healing. We are about to reach the moment that changed both family stories. Before you continue, what do you think cracked this case open? The witness, the truck, the investigation, or the combination of all three? Leave your answer in the comments before the final part. On January 12, 2007, Ben Ownby was found alive. So was Shawn Hornbeck. The white pickup truck had led investigators to Michael Devlin. The apartment revealed the connection, and the investigation that began with one missing boy uncovered another. Years later, the Missouri State Highway Patrol would remember the case as one of the notable events of 2007, emphasizing that both boys were found alive and that the investigation involved local, state, and federal authorities. The FBI likewise remembered the case as an example of agencies, the public, and missing child organizations working together. The Bureau said its personnel helped process hundreds of leads, search the apartment, support the boys and their families, and continue investigating possible connections to other cases. For Ben Ownby, the most important part of the story is not simply that he became the subject of a national investigation. It is that he came home. For Shawn Hornbeck, the most important part is that after more than 4 years of being missing, he was found alive and reunited with his family. And for both families, January 12, 2007 became a date that divided their lives into before and after. Before the discovery, they were families searching for answers. After the discovery, they were families beginning the difficult work of rebuilding. That is why this case continues to be remembered. Not because it was sensational, not because it produced headlines, but because 2 missing children were found alive. One disappearance brought another to light, and a single remembered detail helped lead investigators to both. Ben Ownby's name should not be remembered only as part of Michael Devlin's criminal case. Ben was a 13-year-old boy whose family expected him to come home from school. His disappearance changed an entire community, and his rescue changed the fate of another missing child. The lesson is not that every missing person case will end this way. Many do not. The lesson is that missing children need immediate attention, careful investigation, and people willing to speak when they see something that may matter. The witness who remembered that white truck could not have known how important the observation would become. But he remembered. He spoke, and investigators listened. 4 days after Ben disappeared, 2 families received the news they had been waiting for. Their children were alive. The investigation continued. The court proceedings followed, and Michael Devlin ultimately pleaded guilty to the crimes connected to both boys. But the strongest image to carry forward from this case is not a courtroom. It is not an arrest. It is not the suspect. It is the moment a missing child investigation became a rescue of 2 children. One boy's disappearance revealed another. And because people paid attention, followed the evidence, and kept searching, 2 families were given something that many missing child families spend years hoping for: a homecoming. Ben's story is therefore not only a story about disappearance, it is a story about recognition, about persistence, about the importance of a witness, and about what can happen when separate pieces of information finally connect. For Ben, the journey home took 4 days. For Shawn, it took more than 4 years. But both boys made it home, and that is the part of the story worth remembering. If you want more carefully researched true crime stories about real cases, subscribe to The Silent Evidence. Every case deserves an answer. Every family deserves the truth.